following program on KROC is sponsored and paid for by Meshbesher Spence.
Zach Bauer is in the house.
Good morning.
How you doing, Zach?
I'm doing terrific.
We are going to be talking about the difference between careless driving, reckless driving, and criminal vehicular operation.
Yeah, so all three parts of kind of, obviously, the criminal statute, but specifically kind of the traffic aspect of that criminal statute. And very small differences between that conduct, but obviously major differences in the way in which it can impact a person when it comes to criminal charges. Starting with kind of the most serious thing, which is criminal vehicular operation. These are high-level felony offenses typically, especially when it involves potential death of an individual or significant bodily harm.
It doesn't have to do with the drinking?
Well, it can be two different parts of that
Okay.
operation. So it can be, there's part of the statute that says you can be, if you're under the influence of alcohol or over .08, which is kind of an absolute in Minnesota, or under the influence of a controlled substance, then the state has to prove that, number one, your driving conduct was negligent, and secondly, that it was a substantial factor in the death.
Okay.
There's another part of that statute which says that you can be driving free and clear of alcohol and or controlled substances, but driving your vehicle in a grossly negligent standard, which is interesting because nobody took the time to actually describe what gross negligence is in the statute, so we've kind of had to make it up as we go along, which isn't always a good way to do it, but that's what we're doing. So those are things that kind of get you in that position. I usually tell clients it's a situation where you blow through a stoplight and you're over .08, where there's negligent driving conduct, and but for that driving conduct, this accident wouldn't happen, and it was a substantial factor. Or the person that's driving blindfolded down the road at 100 miles an hour and just doesn't seem to care about anything that may happen, that certainly is gross negligence.
Texting while driving?
Texting while driving probably doesn't get you to gross negligence because
Even though it should.
Even though it should, I would probably...
That's right, that's my commentary.
No, absolutely. I think that it probably falls more into the line of potentially reckless driving.
Which is the second.
Which is kind of the second tier down.
Okay.
So reckless driving can be either a misdemeanor or a gross misdemeanor, depending on whether or not the harm that's caused is either great bodily harm or death. And in a death situation or in the great bodily harm situation, the state has to be able to show that your driving conduct was such that you either should have been aware or you consciously disregarded. So even though I know that I'm aware of this is problematic, or I should be aware of it, or I just say, you know what, I'm not even going to worry about it. Even though in the back of your mind you shouldn't be texting, right? And that it is a substantial deviation from normal driving conduct by a reasonable person. So here's where I think we start to, as society moves, this is going to be one of the issues of it's certainly something that we don't condone. We don't like it. We shouldn't do it. We know all the different factors that talk about how texting is almost as bad as drunk driving, quite frankly, when it comes to your reaction time. But is it a substantial deviation from what a reasonable person? Right now, I would say it is. In 15 years from now, maybe not. I mean, as you think about those people that are in their in their teens, are they going to be looking at texting the same way that maybe our parents looked at driving around with a cell phone glued to your ear? Both can be distracting. And so I think it's going to be interesting how that kind of plays out. Right now, I think, clearly, if you're texting and driving, you cause an accident and they can show that you were texting at the time that the accident took place, I think that clearly puts you into that reckless standard.
Okay.
Otherwise, we drop down further to a careless driving standard, which is, quite frankly, you're driving in a situation where you're maybe weaving over the lines and you cause an accident. You're distracted in a form, but maybe not to the level of texting, although from my perspective, texting could either be careless or reckless. I think it's a lot based upon how the accident take place and, quite frankly, what the injuries are.
So careless, reckless, and then what was the first one?
And then criminal vehicular operation.
Criminal.
So you've been following this case in Byron where the gentleman, guy hit the kid who was, going down an embankment on a wagon, went through a barrow ditch or whatever, the ditch into the road, and he was coming by. Speed limit was 55. He was going under the speed limit, but he was had a few beers beforehand, so legally he was over the limit or at the limit? I can't.
So, based upon full disclosure, I don't know all the facts.
Mm-hmm.
I have had a chance to look at what's come out in the complaint yesterday. And
he's been charged with a gross misdemeanor, reckless driving.
Right. And so, from my perspective, what I did read was that his blood concentration was between 0.081 and 0.101, which would mean that he is above the legal limit of 0.080. The state still then, in a criminal vehicle operation case, would have to show that his driving conduct was negligent and that it was a substantial contributing factor to the death. And so I think the issue that potentially exists here is that doesn't appear to be on its face negligent, in the sense that none of the driving conduct in and of itself, the driving below the speed limit, the coming, I'm assuming, to a stop, this would be one of the factors I don't know. Mm-hmm. How did you do on your field sobriety tests? How was your reaction time? Could that accident have been avoided if a person was sober? Those are some of the factors that have to be taken into consideration in making a charging decision. But the state did not feel that was something they could reach, which is, but then charges him with a reckless driving, which is a situation where he has to consciously disregard the risk. And the risk appears to be simply drinking 3 beers on an empty stomach. And I'm not sure. I think that's a tricky level to get to. I mean, I think certainly there seems to be evidence for a DUI that exists, but it's a tragic situation. It's from the outside looking in, it's an interesting legal issue. But certainly I know that everybody kind of mourns for that whole situation. It's not an easy decision to make when you're a prosecutor to make those decisions, and not a good situation when you're the person being charged either.
Got a 5-year-old that lost his life. Family dealing with that. A brother that was playing with him at the time, an older brother that's got to live with that for the rest of his life, and then a guy who just happened to be in the wrong place, apparently. And he wasn't speeding, and he did stop right away, or at least, he didn't drive off.
Right.
Police Chief Peterson, though, I think about something that he said so long ago. It was probably 10 years ago when he was talking about, who's got the right of way in a crosswalk, the pedestrian or the driver. And he's like, you can split hairs over who's right, who's wrong, but in the end, somebody's dead. Mm-hmm. And so that's where this is interesting, because you're coming at it from the legal angle of things. Right. But I think sometimes people do get so wrapped up in, well, it's okay if I have 2 or 3 beer, this situation, but any situation, it's okay if I text. In the end, what you're doing is putting more at risk the likelihood that someone can be severely injured or killed. And I just love it that he just kind of broke it down like that, and it's stuck with me ever since.
Mm-hmm. In an instant, life can change for everybody. Mm-hmm. So you need to be always kind of, hyper vigilant, I think, is the term that my wife uses occasionally. So,
hey, if somebody needs an attorney, needs some legal advice, and they want to get a hold of you at Meshbesher and Spence, how do they do that?
Phone number is 507-280-8090, or you can visit us online at www.meshbesher.com, and we'll have a happier topic next week, Rich.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'll hold you to it. Zach Bauer from Meshbesher and Spence.